Hi, welcome to this event on Brazil's Choice. I'm Thomas Carruthers, co-director of the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My great pleasure to host and moderate this event today. In just 3 days, Brazil will go to the polls in national elections that will see an election for president, for the Chamber of Deputies, for a number of seats in the upper house, for governors, for state legislatures, huge elections in a country of more than 200 million people. That's potentially a political turning point. Although the elections will cover many offices, all eyes will be on the presidential contest. There are 11 candidates for president, but again, all eyes will be on two of them, the incumbent president, Jair Bolsonaro, and probably, obviously, his main challenger, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the former president who served as president of Brazil from 2003 to 2010. Many observers are seeing this election as a referendum on democracy in Brazil, given the turbulent and chaotic and often provocative presidency of Bolsonaro, who came to the office in early 2019 and has been ruling in a fashion that often challenges basic democratic norms and institutions. At the same time, it's also a referendum on many core policy issues in Brazil, ranging from social policy and economic policy, climate policy, and many others. There's a lot at stake for Brazil, for Latin America, and for the world. Today in this event, we're going to try to gain some perspective on these elections, try to take stock of where has Brazilian politics come to in the last several years on the eve of these elections. What are the implications of these elections, given different possible outcomes? I'm really delighted we have with us three top-notch Brazilian experts who are going to give us their ideas and perspectives. We have with us Matthias Spector, who is a professor at the School of International Relations at the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Sao Paulo, and a frequent commentator as well as academic scholar on many issues relating to Brazil and Latin American politics. We have Maria Hermínia Tavares, who is a senior researcher at the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning, a former dean of the Institute of International Relations at the University of Sao Paulo, and a well-known thinker about Brazil, its place in the world. And last but not least, Oliver Stunkel, an associate professor in the School of International Relations at the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Sao Paulo, and a prolific commentator on current Brazilian affairs and regional affairs generally. Welcome to all three of you. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to your perspectives. I'm going to just take us through a series of questions about where Brazil is and where it may be going. Later in the event, we'll have a chance to take some of your questions that you'll pose in the chat function. But let me start off with really a basic question, which is, where has Bolsonaro taken Brazilian politics during his presidency? It's been a turbulent time. The news out of Brazil is constantly, as I mentioned, provocative. It's challenges to the system, controversy, polarization, uncertainty, I would say. And if we just try to step back calmly, even though these elections are extremely consequential and very fraught, if we try to step back and say, how much has he really changed Brazilian politics during his presidency? If we, in a sense, clear aside all the smoke and the noise and say, what has really changed? What would you highlight as several of the most important changes from his presidency as it has been so far? Let me turn first to Matthias Spector. Matthias, what are your thoughts on this?
So, Tom, I'd say the single most relevant component, the single most relevant legacy of the Bolsonaro years is the reopening of the question of Brazilian democracy. Before the 2018 election, one could question the quality of Brazil's democracy, but there was, by and large, consensus that Brazil was a largely consolidated democracy. And all of a sudden, in the last 4 years, these big issues have been out in the open once again. Civil-military relationships came back to the fore after many years of not being there at all. Questions about the reliability of the electoral process and social trust in the reliability of the electoral process. questions pertaining to the role of justice and the justice system, and whether the Supreme Court and all the other courts had been or are politicized or not. Of course, they came to the fore in the Lula years. In the wake of the Mensalão scandal, there was a lot of pushback against the courts, and yet there was a general sense that the big basic questions about Brazilian democracy were settled, and that Brazil was on the way of consolidating its democratic rule. These questions are now no longer obvious, and we're asking ourselves questions about, what's going to happen if Bolsonaro loses the election? Will he leave? Will he leave pacifically? Will there be groups of people, pro-Bolsonaro fanatics, who want to take arms? Political violence is on the up across Brazil in a context marked by two key features, I think. One of them you mentioned, and it's rising polarization. Brazil, comparatively, in the last 35 years, had relatively low affective polarization and relatively low party polarization. This is a system, it's a multi-party system. It's not a political system that in its party structure is polarized. And yet what we've seen, and this is not the cause for this is not Bolsonaro. This began in the wake of the impeachment process against Dilma Rousseff. But what Bolsonaro has left behind him is a society that is deeply polarized, where affective polarization is at worrying levels. We've had political violence connected to the polarization in the last few months that we hadn't seen in democracy. And the other thing, and with this I end, is the context of the lack of economic growth. I mean, the backdrop to the story of the Bolsonaro years is an economic situation that doesn't improve. Brazil has shown dreadful figures years on end after having a very successful decade in the early 2000s. And that reversal of expectations we've learned elsewhere in Latin America and in the developing world comes at an enormous cost. So moving forward, there's a lot of cause for concern as to where Brazilian democracy is heading.
Matthias, thank you. You've raised a number of fundamental points. Some of those I think I'd like to come back to, but I'd like to get more ideas out on the table. So let me turn to Maria Hermínia. What would you like to add to the picture that Matthias?
Yes, I completely agree with Matthias. I would say, rephrasing something that he has said, that for a long time, the political competition in Brazil was a kind of centripetal competition between two broad coalitions that go to the center, a center left and a center right coalition that shared a common ground around democratic values and democratic rights that were established by the 1998 Constitution. What happened, and we are not discussing why, with the Bolsonaro election, is that the right broke down. The center right coalition broke down and emerged, a part of it emerged as an extreme right force that is to which Bolsonaro has given a face and a political representation. So from the point of view of the Brazilian political system, now we must deal with extreme right, which is not a majoritarian, but which is huge. During his government, the polls showed that he had support from 25 to around 35% of the Brazilians. That is to say, this is huge in a country like ours, and so this has completely changed the Brazilian political landscape. As a president, contrary to what the literature about new populism, right-wing populism says, Bolsonaro didn't try to control the institutions. He actually only provoked them And in doing so, in a certain way, he tried to delegitimize them. But he didn't really try to control courts, to control the press. He's in a strategy of confrontation, of permanent confrontation, which I think creates a very, very tough and very difficult political environment. But he's lost. He couldn't do what has been done in Hungary, has been done in India. Up to now, he lost. He was contained, I think, by Brazilian democratic institutions and also by the Brazilian organized society.
Excellent. That's a very interesting development of what Matias said. Oliver, over to you with the same question.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to what Matias and Maria Hermínia have said, that I think that Bolsonaro has questioned a series of issues that were consensual among Brazil's major political forces when it comes, for example, to the role of religion in politics. I think we now have an increased role that has had a direct impact on areas where there hasn't really been a major debate, for example, public education, public health. I think there wasn't a strong sort of anti-science current that would really have an impact on the way that, for example, the vaccines would be rolled out, or that broad issues would be handled in public education. I think we've seen significant rollbacks, there reversals of progress that has been made over the past decades. And I think the other issue, just adding to what Matias said about civil-military relations, I think that over the past 4 years, it has been apparent that the process of consolidating civilian leadership over security forces in general has not been as perhaps complete as we would have liked to think. That not only involves the armed forces, but also the military police, which nominally stands below the governors, but governors have actually shown quite some concern about their actual capacity to control the military police. I think that's also something to keep in mind. It's not only about the armed forces, but also about domestic security institutions, which are now seen to be, in some cases, the hotbed of authoritarian sentiment. And perhaps the last thing is that there was a broad consensus in Brazil in favor of using the space that multilateralism offers to a country, which essentially is dependent on a rules-based international order. There's also always been an ambiguous relationship to, liberal order, of course, and Brazil has been quite resistant in many ways, but in essence, it has embraced that order and sought to challenge that order within the existing structures. So rather than, let's say, abolish the UN Security Council, actually gain a seat at the table of the powerful and seek reform from within the system. And I think now we have a very different confrontational structure that sees Brazil largely isolated and not seen as a constructive partner, not seen as a contributor of global public goods, but a country that, particularly in the West, is not seen at all as a partner, but rather a pariah. And I think that is something which is totally new, which hadn't been the case, at least over the past 20 years in Brazilian politics.
I'm going to focus in on the question of civil-military relations, just to take a bit further, both what you said, Matias, and Maria Hermínia. On the one hand, he hasn't tried to control some institutions like the judiciary and has, encountered real resistance. But in the domain of civil-military relations, my understanding is he did introduce a much higher degree of military representation in political, roles. And so in that sense, it's not really control, but he has changed the balance of how the military plays a role in politics. Is that right? Let me go back to you, Maria Hermínia. Do you balance that, or how would you describe it?
Yes, absolutely. But on the other hand, I think that in previous period there has been some ambiguity in this aspect. You see, actually, the military were called to assume some tasks, in growing tasks, through a constitutional provision, which is law and order operations. And those began actually with the PT, actually Fernando Henrique, but very, very little. Actually, with the PT during the World Cup, Olympics, and step by step, the civil government have given some important responsibilities to the military, but still the defense ministry was in civil hands, and this changed under Temer. Under President Temer, after Rousseff's impeachment, we had the first military as defense secretary. And I think this is it's an important moment. What Bolsonaro has done is to string this kind of call to the military, to perform some law and order activities. They should do it, okay? And this, I think this is a change. We don't know how deep is this.
Yes.
We actually, our colleagues who study the military are not very sure about what is the meaning, what are the consequences of this perpetual call from Bolsonaro to the military. But actually, he has a consistent policy of cajoling the military. He goes to every ceremony. He protects them during the social security reform. He raised their salaries, and so there's a consistent policy of courting the military.
Right.
I think this is new.
Matthias, would you like to add a perspective on that in terms of the military role in politics during Bolsonaro's presidency?
Sure. My take would be this. In the early 90s, a consensus kind of formed in Brazil that, even if Brazil, unlike Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil didn't have a proper transitional justice coming out of dictatorship days, the consensus was that the military were in the barracks, they were busy with the Amazon, they had enormous amount of toys, they had a big impact in the national budget, so they were an interest group with good representation across governments, but they were in their place, in the barracks, not participating in politics. What happened under Bolsonaro is, first of all, they are now seen as a very powerful interest group with a lot of voice opportunities in the administration, with a take in the national budget that is really very expressive, but also they've been encouraged to express themselves politically. The problem with expressing themselves politically is that, of course, politicizes the armed forces and it cracks the armed forces. We have to remember that the reason why Brazilian dictators, after 15 years of dictatorship, decide to liberalize the system because they're worried that politicization of the armed forces might produce cracks that are so profound that you're going to have clashes within the forces. I'm not suggesting that we are anywhere near that now, but the forces are deeply divided over Bolsonaro. It's not at all clear what the lines of hierarchy are. As Oliver was mentioning before, one of the big worrying signs of the Bolsonaro years is that there is a bunch of people in the security forces, in particular among the lower echelons, that are virulently pro-Bolsonaro. And even after Bolsonaro goes, these people are very likely to unite around certain themes that are anathema to the left. So if one of the bad legacies, if you want, of the Bolsonaro years is the empowerment, the political empowerment of security forces, in particular at the lower levels, And this is something, as Maria Herminia was saying, this is absolutely new. This is a phenomenon of the last 5 years and a worrying one to me.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to move to the next question, unless Oliver, there's something more you wanted to add to that, or shall I move on?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think to some extent the growing influence of the military is also a consequence of domestic instability, of a vacuum of power, because the armed forces are still seen as a relatively trustworthy institution in Brazil. In part, perhaps, because there hasn't really been a truth commission that has exposed all what has actually happened. So it was still, even 10, 15 years ago, sort of politically okay to say that, well, the military dictatorship wasn't that bad, etc. So the armed forces, in a way, were able to protect their image to some extent. And there's still, I think, let's say, a dynamic that if things destabilize in politics, then the armed forces can provide, at least symbolically, sort of some kind of stability. And I think that it's not a coincidence that the armed forces have reemerged after the period of stable politics and stable economic growth ended sort of in the middle of the last decade.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn to the question of what can change if the election goes such that Lula is elected, either in the first round or in the second round. He comes into office. And we look at the things that you talked about that Bolsonaro brought into Brazilian politics. We have an interesting sort of a mixed picture. On the one hand, we have the fact that he tried to insert sort of a new level of polarization into Brazilian political life, political control over certain institutions, new civil-military relations. But then, as Maria Herminia said, he lost. He was contained in some ways. And if he's defeated in the election and things proceed somewhat normally, that project will have been defeated. Yet, as she also points out, there's the right has changed in Brazil. And the 20 to 40% of people who have supported him will still be there. They'll still be part of Brazilian society and politics. And so there'll be the question of how does that change or not change in the years to come if there's a new Lula presidency. So I'd like you to reflect a bit on what will be possible to change and what is likely to stay the same. To what extent can Brazil get on a better path? Or to what extent is it now in a period where it is just a much more deeply divided polity and society that's going to struggle, as the United States has in the years since Donald Trump was president? We're still living through day by day the legacies of the Trump presidency, still trying to figure out what has changed, what has not changed, what is possible to change. It seems as though Brazil will be in a kind of a similar period. Let's think about what that might look like. Matthias?
Sure, Tom. So I think for a fact, it's easy to predict that on some key policy areas, there's going to be enormous change. I think education, health, the environment, and foreign policy are crystal clear. We're going to have a very different story. And the Lula administration, which is a broad coalition, will try to restore and rebuild what has been destroyed in the last 4 years. So that's the positive side of that coin. But then there's the negative side of that coin. I think, first of all, and this is different from the US situation where you have two main parties. In the case of Brazil, Lula will come to office, in all likelihood, I think, on the back of a coalition that is not united around a program beyond unseating Bolsonaro. So this broad coalition is a powerful one, as we can tell from the polls, and it's likely to win the election. But this is not a coalition that was formed around a program for Brazil in the next 4 years. So my anticipation is that on the 2nd of January, 2023, the cracks will begin to show within that coalition. Part of the story behind those cracks, I think, is the fact that the Lula campaign, is now the promise is to first unseat Bolsonaro and secondly, to restore the quality of life for Brazilians. But there is no sense that we're going to have a fiscal adjustment, which looks very likely if you listen to economists, so that before things get better, they may well get worse. And it remains to be seen if the Lula administration will be willing and politically able to undergo the adjustment that economists say is necessary, or whether he won't be able to deliver or won't want to deliver. And then Brazil will have to coexist with high levels of inflation, which is also a new thing we didn't mention before. One of the legacies of the Bolsonaro years is levels of inflation that Brazilians have not seen for a generation. And this is highly worrying. I would say the next worrying thing, Tom, is the relationship with the military, as both Oliver and Arminia were saying. For me, it's not at all clear what the military commanders are going to do with Lula, what that relationship is going to be like, how much Lula will force civilian leadership over the armed forces. So putting all these negative sides together, I think it's plausible to imagine that, like in the United States, there will be a well of support for Bolsonarismo after Bolsonaro. Even if it changes name, even if the leaders are other leaders, as Maria Arminia was saying, the extreme right now knows that there is a fruitful, a profitable electoral market for their message. And that's not going to go away.
Maria Arminia, would you like to come in on that? I'm particularly interested in this question of what happens, because this is, a profound dilemma for democracies. What happens when there emerges a political base of support for a party that's not very democratic, or a political figure? How do you live with this in a democracy?
First of all, we are talking here as if Bolsonaro loses and goes back home, or to Miami, or to whatever. That's not clear. I think that he can try something like his Capitol Hill. And he has some social basis to do this. I don't think that this can succeed. I think that the political system has reacted to Bolsonaro, and in these days we are seeing people from his coalition to say, well, nothing is happening with the electoral system, but I think that he can try some stupid thing. This is so we can maybe have some turmoil from here to January. This is the first thing. The second, about Lula's. Lula is one of the most pragmatic left-wing politician I know. He's quite different from his party, from the PT militants. He's a pragmatic politician. And I think he's aware that he's coming back, and he has only one term because he's quite old. And I think he will behave according to rules regarding economic issues in his way, but I don't think he will do some irresponsible. He would take some irresponsible measures regarding fiscal balance and all that. I think he has some issues he can show rapidly how to improve in environment, education, health, foreign policy, but he will have to have a policy towards the military. And no government since democratization had a clear policy what to do with the military, how to send them back to the barracks without humiliating them, or without downsizing their importance. I think this is a very delicate issue. I don't know how he will deal with it, but I think this is an important challenge. And the other, of course, he's coming back after a very successful administration under very different and tougher conditions, economic, internationally. And so It won't be easy. His coalition is very broad, but in the past was also. This won't be a PT's government. It will be a center-right, left coalition with all these problems. And fine, I would like to add that we have the luck of having a fragmented multi-party system and the lack of not having a Bolsonarista party. So survival of Bolsonarism, although there is a social basis for this and it will continue to be, and now they have their identities, their symbols, their and all that. You don't have, they are not in the Republican Party. They can go to a party, or at least this demands a party building, which Bolsonaro couldn't do, didn't show the capacity to do. On the other hand, he has 3 sons, 4 actually, but 3, 2 of them pretty capable of become a right-wing leader, I think. And so, I don't know.
Yeah. Oliver, we need to pause on this question, which Maria Armenia brought up. You just published an article in Foreign Affairs Today, directly addressing this question that's on many people's mind here in Washington and in other capitals around the world, of what will Bolsonaro do if faced with defeat, either in the first round or in the second round. You laid out several scenarios in kind of descending order of dangerousness for democracy, but we need to put our finger on this question and pause on it. And you artfully, I thought in the article, didn't make exactly a prediction, but you sort of indicated what it seemed to be for me from reading the article. You kind of leaned one way or another. Why don't you just lay out for people what are the I guess there were really 3 scenarios. And in a sense, I don't like to ask people to make political predictions, because I always hate it when people ask me to make political predictions, because then I'm wrong afterwards. So I've learned not to make them. I'm not going to ask you to predict precisely what it'll do, but talk us through this issue.
Sure. I think that Bolsonaro has for such a long time now questioned the electoral system and has so systematically spread his message that if he loses, it's because the elections were stolen. That in the end, it doesn't even matter that much what he says on Sunday. I think if he conceded on Sunday, a lot of his followers would probably think it's fake, that this is just wrong because it contradicts of what he's done before. Research suggests that about a quarter of Bolsonaro voters want Bolsonaro to not concede if he loses, because they either think it doesn't matter that he loses, they just want him to hold on to power, or because they think the election has actually been stolen. And then you have basically 3 scenarios. The first is that the president will just say, this election was stolen, I'm still the president. Some followers may agree, but it doesn't really go much further than that, and that the transition will basically take place. And you have an amount of people who think the government is illegitimate, but the transition is basically not traumatic. And that, I think, is directly related to what we've just discussed, is what is Brazil's future. It really depends on whether this election will produce trauma, or if it's a process of healing, of whether this is the beginning of a chapter of Brazil coming together and overcoming its internal divisions. The second scenario is basically a January 6th scenario, where the president says, I'm the real winner of this election, and I'm hereby calling on my supporters, preferably the armed ones. By the way, this is also a big change. We've seen an explosion of arms purchases, weapons purchases in Brazil over the past years. The weapons culture, I think, is also somewhat new in Brazil. And that some of these people actually may use violence in order to trouble the transition, attempt to stop the transition, but that will eventually fail like it did on January 6th. In that scenario, you basically have the armed forces stand back, perhaps occasionally intervening to calm down the situation, but actually not going further than that. And then you have, I think, the third scenario, in which the president also says that he is a legitimate winner of this election, and that the tensions and the protests that emerges is large enough to actually make the transition difficult or cause large-scale uncertainty, and that could then evolve some kind of role for the armed forces. Now, I think it's important to point out, I think the initiative, the armed forces taking the initiative to stop the transition, that's very unlikely. Like like happened in Peru, where the president announced a coup and then you had tanks closing the Supreme Court and Congress. I don't think we'll see that at all. But I think what's more worrisome is like a Bolivia type situation where there's a temporary outage of the electoral court's website, perhaps very sophisticated deepfake videos about malfunction of the voting machines, and people take to the streets and there's violence, and then the armed forces may be asked to sort of pacify the situation. And I think the more we move towards the latter scenarios, the more energy and time it will take for Brazil to heal from this very, traumatizing process that Brazilian politics has seen over the past years.
Matthias, does that sound about like the way you see it, or do you see anything else, or do you see something different you'd like to add to that picture?
So the picture is really depressing. Let me give you my take on it. I agree with Oliver entirely that there is a lively market now in the coming days and weeks, especially if we go to a second round, which looks likely now, towards the end of the month. It's likely that we're going to see parts of the Bolsonaro voters protesting in one way or another. And it's plausible to imagine that we're going to have some kind of trouble in polling stations. We cannot discard that. That could well happen. And if that were to happen, then the fake news machine is going to be alive and well. We've learned that with Trump, but we've also learned that from Bolsonaro himself. I am a bit less pessimistic than Oliver, though, for the following reason. One of the things that Bolsonaro achieved is uniting the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had been very divided in the latter part of the Lula administration, profoundly divided over Dilma, divided over the impeachment, divided over Temer, but now united in opposition to Bolsonaro. The Electoral Court in particular came out with a new regulation just now, just this week, saying that if any of the candidates spreads lies about the electoral process, and they don't define what the lies are, how they will know lies when they see them, but if they spread lies, then these people could lose their political rights. And this is a very powerful message to the entire political class in Brazil, because it's not only Bolsonaro who could lose his political rights, and he certainly doesn't want to do that, but also his party. Members of his party could end up in that situation. There's another factor which I think gives me a bit of reassurance, and that's the fact that in this election, we're electing not only a president, but we're electing governors, and we're electing the entire lower chamber, and we're electing a part of the Senate. If the electoral process is questioned, if we need to redo the election, then all of the people who will get elected for legislative office and for state governorship office, all of that goes up the air. So I think there's going to be, in all likelihood, a consensus among the political class that the election is valid. None of this suggests, however, that Bolsonaro will accept the defeat, because, think with me, there is a serious possibility that after Bolsonaro leaves office, he ends up in prison. I mean, we just had a president going to prison in Lula, so it's not unimaginable. So what's his best strategy to try and avoid prison is to say that he's the victim of a political coup, right? So he has a big incentive to say that he did not lose the election, that he won the election following Trump. That, however, as I was saying, doesn't necessarily translate in him not accepting the result. I think he will not be there to hand over office to Lula. I think the transition is going to be a mess. It's going to be a nasty transition where the group that leaves office tries to do, trailblaze the state apparatus. Brazil has a very long transition period. The next administration doesn't take over until the 1st of January, 2023. But given all these factors together, I think we're going to see Bolsonaro challenge the results, but I think we're going to see the institutions unite against the challenging of the result. And Bolsonaro will use this for the next phase in his political life.
I have a few more questions, but I want to invite listeners to send in any questions that they may want. We'll see if we can find some time for them. I'm afraid I have to ask this question, although it's kind of an unpleasant one, is I suppose it's possible that Donald Trump will have comments on the election on Sunday and on the integrity of the elections. Will that make any difference if he comes out in favor of whatever line Bolsonaro takes and backs him up, or is that just kind of additional noise in the background? Maria, Maria Arena? Hold on, I think you're muted. Yeah, there you go. We hear you now.
I think only for the Bolsonaro's people. On the other hand, I think that international recognition of the electoral process can be a very important pressure to stabilize the process. I don't think Trump's opinion would be important, but I think the United States Senate opinion will be important. The United States government opinion and recognition of the results will be important. The same for European countries, and so I think there is a space for international pressure in order to have the results respected that can be effective.
Okay. Oliver, I'd like to ask you a regional question, if I might. Brazil, if Lula comes back to office, I would say Brazil, it seems like, has an opportunity to rebuild relations with a number of South American countries. You have now, of course, in Colombia and Peru, left-wing presidents who've come in. You have the Peronists still in Argentina. You have Chile going through a process trying to integrate new leftist currents there. Brazil's been kind of divorced in some ways from the rest of South America in recent years, not economically, but in some ideological and political ways. Is this an important moment? Although recognizing that this would be more of a coalition government, not a real PT militant left kind of government. Nevertheless, Lula is a figure in the Latin American left of some historical consequence. Would this be an important new era for Brazil and its relations with South America? The rest of
Well, I think certainly there will be a lot of symbolism. I would expect the Lula administration to hold a big summit next year and invite leaders of the region. But I think that several structural reasons explain why we won't see sort of part two of Brazil's regional leadership project that we've seen in the 2000s. And the first reason is that the 2000s, the first pink wave, were all about political stability, high approval ratings. And it's fairly easy to govern because of high commodity prices, later in the decade, low US interest rates. And all these leaders which thought about a regional project, they were staying in office for quite some time. I mean, almost everybody got reelected easily back then. And now it's the opposite. I mean, the anti-incumbent sentiment in the region, I think, is here to stay unless there's some dramatic change internationally. But you have high US interest rates, low commodity prices. The pink wave, I think, will end before it has really begun, because you could very much see a new government center-right in Peru, in Argentina. We have elections next year. So I think the space for meaningful cooperation is more limited than it was back in the day. And the other factor is that Brazilian foreign policy is really only, or in most cases, innovative and ambitious if there's a modicum of domestic stability. Because since 2013, virtually all Brazilian presidents had to always sort of look at the domestic situation because there was a risk of impeachment. And I think unless we go back to that, it will be very difficult for Lula to emerge as a meaningful player in the region. And the third reason is actually that because of deindustrialization, we no longer have these big construction companies that were very keen on building, the metro in Caracas or highways in Peru. Now, actually, Latin American countries are above all competing for access to the Chinese market. So I think when you ask sort of the captains of Brazil's economy, they're no longer that keen on moving closer to the region. And that explains why when the Bolsonaro government basically ignored the region and the Minister of the Economy attacked Argentina and Mercosur, there wasn't really that much of a pushback. So I think we now face a much more limited potential for Brazil re-engaging the region than it was the case 20 years ago when Lula became president.
I'm going to go to a couple of the questions in the chat. Our listeners want to take us back to the role of the military, and it's on their minds. So there's two questions here. Jennifer McCoy asked, will the military actually play an important role in the elections themselves? Are they guarding the voting, or if there's a dispute over the result, do they have a direct role? And a broader question by Rafael Divani is the current co-optation of the armed forces that Bolsonaro has carried out as a result of some level of alienation of the military with past governments. So the military's role in the election themselves, and is what Bolsonaro did with the military a result of kind of a growing alienation on the part of the military? Matthias, let me turn to you for reflections in either of those questions.
Okay, so on Jennifer's question, I don't think the armed forces are going to play an important role during the electoral process. I don't think they're going to guard them in any particular sense, no more than it's been the case in the past, and that's the security forces at all levels of the administration that are going to guard, that are going to provide security on Sunday. And I think it's very unlikely that we're going to have a dispute over results coming from the polls, from the polling stations. Brazil has this electronic system, and it's likely that towards the end of the day, at around 8:30 p.m., we will have the results. And these results it's hard to imagine a scenario in which the electoral court says, well, there's a problem with the elections. We don't have results. So very different situation from the one the United States confronted back in Bush versus Gore. So I don't envisage that. What we could have is, of course, Bolsonaro come up with the argument that he didn't lose, that the election was stolen, and then military leaders linked to Bolsonaro echo that view, and then we might have a lot of noise around that. But I don't envisage a role for the military beyond that. And as far as Rafael's question goes, Rafael is suggesting that in previous administration, the military were somehow alienated from office. I would challenge that notion, Rafael, by suggesting that, when Brazil transitioned to democracy, there was no transitional justice. There was an amnesty law created by the military to protect the military. There was no revision of that law. The military benefited enormously in terms of their social security, as Arminia was saying. They benefited from successive pay rises over the years. They have secured enormous budget support to buy all sorts of weapon systems for each one of the forces. So I don't think it's a case of alienation. I think what it is that Bolsonaro, when he came to office, he knew full well that, as Oliver said, the armed forces are the one institution in Brazil that get trust from the people, that people trust the armed forces. Bolsonaro wanted to use that trust to bolster his own position, and he opened the door for the military in a big way. Remember also, Bolsonaro comes to office in the wake of Dilma's administration, and Dilma was the only president that had the guts to have a truth commission. The Truth Commission was enormously divisive for the armed forces. The armed forces opposed the Truth Commission from day one. And Bolsonaro used that knowledge to then reinterpret the past, to suggest the military dictatorship was not a dictatorship at all, to celebrate the use of torture as a political tool, as he has done ever since. So I think the reasons why Bolsonaro's turned to the military is not to do with the fact that democratic Brazil alienated the military. If anything, democratic Brazil didn't transition as fast, as thoroughly as other countries in the region have done, and that's come at a cost, as we now see.
Thank you. Either of you like to comment on that, or should we move to the next question?
I would like to come back to the regional issue that Oliver raised.
Yeah, we hear you. Yeah, we hear you.
Yes, because I think he's right. Conditions to a Brazilian protagonism in the region are very different from the past. But I think there are new important issues that maybe can be the basis for some kind of collaboration, and which will require collaboration, and this is the Amazon. During the Bolsonaro's government, the Amazon protection of Amazon became a huge issue. This has to do, is very intertwined with crime, with the illegal activities of lots of sorts. And so in order to tackle to have some kind of policy regarding the Amazon, Brazil will have to talk to its neighbors, because the Amazon is a huge part of the Brazilian territory, but it's not exclusively a Brazilian issue, and to have effective policies regarding crime, drug traffic, and all that in the borders will require some kind of new forms of collaboration that were not in the agenda in the past. And so I think maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I think there is a new space for regional action and regional protagonism of Brazil regarding environment in general, but especially regarding the Amazonian dilemmas.
We just have about 5 minutes left, and we do have one specific question in the chat, which I'm afraid we won't get to, about whether or not Lula might put a freeze on Brazil-OECD relations as a result of the PT having some hesitations about the accession process. But I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to that, because I want to take these last 5 minutes just to step back and say, the question of democratic recovery in a democracy, when you undergo some serious tremors, and you wonder if you can come through this and get back on the road. I can't think of a question more central to the United States right now. When many people asked me after the election in 2020, when Trump lost, they said, "Do you feel better now about the future of American democracy?" I had a partial yes and a partial no. The yes was for obvious reasons, but the no was the forces that had been building up and magnified by Trump were still there in the country. And as Maria Armenia rightly makes the differentiation in the United States, they're very linked to the evolution of one of the two main parties in the country, which has moved in an anti-democratic direction, unfortunately, in many ways. In Brazil, very different. You don't have such a party. You don't have Bolsonaro really seeming to have a political future in the way Trump may have in this country. So if I ask each of the three of you, it's a victory for Lula either in the first round or in the second round, and I say to you, so Matias, Maria Armenia, Oliver, do you feel better about the future of democracy in Brazil, or how much better do you feel, and what's maybe the one thing that still worries you the most? So we'll go back in the order that we started. Matias?
So a Lula win is certainly a positive news for Brazilian democracy. There's no doubts about it. You can have your qualms about Lula, you can critique him on many scores, but there is no doubt that this is not an authoritarian personality, it's not an autocratic project, and the same cannot be said of Bolsonaro. So if Lula wins, that's good signs for Brazilian democracy. This said, Brazilian democracy has suffered lots from basically Brazil's unending problem with inequality. This is a country that is profoundly unequal in ways that, if anything, it's a miracle that democracy has survived, because the fact is that Brazilian democracy and institutional design has not delivered the goods. For a country that wealthy, for a middle-income country, Brazil does a terrible job at providing education, health, and citizen security for its inhabitants. Its levels of child mortality are unacceptable. Its levels of political violence are unacceptable. Everyday urban violence is absolutely shocking. So what did we expect? Are we really that surprised that there is a political market in Brazil for neo-fascism? I think the answer is no. Now, will Lula be in a position to tackle these issues? Who knows?
Do you feel better, and what will continue to worry you?
Agree.
Hold on, I think, there we go. Go ahead.
I completely agree with Matias, and I don't have too much to add. I have a colleague, which is a colleague of Matias and Oliver, colleagues from Fundação Getúlio Vargas, who is very optimistic regarding democracy in Brazil. And since the beginning of Bolsonaro's government, I had a perpetual dialogue with him about what was happening. And he said, "Oh, okay, calm down. Democracy will resist." And actually, I think he was right. Anyway, as Matias said, we had a very, very divided society in terms of inequalities of all kinds, and in terms of a pervasive poverty that sometimes it's so deep that sometimes our elites don't see it anymore. You see, it's a kind of natural issue, an issue of nature. And this produces continually a space for populism.
Yeah. Okay. Oliver, 1 minute. Where are you on this?
Sure. So I know this is a fraught term, but I think that unless some kind of new social contract can be established, of course, the country will eternally be subject to these years of boom, of temporary stability. And then when the massive reversal of expectation occurs, it will inevitably be a fertile ground for populists, many of them with authoritarian ideas. And I think as long as we can't fix that, we will be having similar debates perhaps 15 years from now. And that, I think, is something the region as a whole must tackle in order to protect democracy in the long term.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. Come this Sunday, and then a second round if it happens. We will all be watching with tremendous interest and concern and sympathy, I would say. I have to say, as an American, that Brazilian politics and American politics have been reverberating on some similar wavelengths in recent years, and it makes the connection between the two countries all the stronger. Not that what happens in Brazil is its own dynamic and reality, but nevertheless, there are relationships that are important. But I think the three of you have helped us understand better what's at stake, what may happen, what likely will happen if there is a Lula victory. And so you've helped deepen our understanding of where Brazil has come to, where it may go. So we thank you for that. We thank all of our audience for tuning in, and hope it's been useful and interesting to you as well. And like I say, we'll all tune in with interest on Sunday and beyond. Thank you very much for joining us.